Hello and welcome to this episode of The Psychology of Almost Everything. My name is Peter Thompson.
And my name is Stewart Grant.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the psychological aspects of acting.
It's now time to introduce this month's guest, the actor Michael Simkins. Michael has appeared in more than 100 plays and musicals, from the National Theatre and the RSC to the Fringe and the West End. His last role was in the hilarious Unfriend with Reece Shearsmith and Francis Barber at the Criterion. Hello, Michael.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Michael, I've just read your book, The Rules of Acting. It's marvellously entertaining and engaging, and I think probably should be compulsory reading for anyone who wants to become an actor. I'd also recommend it to anyone who's interested in theatre. It really is a great read.
Yeah, thanks. It was just my attempt to try and distill the mechanics of the glittering cesspit that is the acting profession, really.
As you know, Michael, this podcast likes to get to the psychological side of things. So we're going to ask you a few questions about being an actor, and where we can, we might make some parallels with our own profession as clinical psychologists and psychotherapists. But let's kick off by asking you, when you've been given a part, when you've been cast, as it were, how do you go about preparing for that role?
Well, the fact is that there are as many ways of preparing for a role as there are actors. And every actor that comes into the rehearsal room has a very different approach. Some will have researched extensively and immersed themselves in the world of the play for which you're asking them to do. Some people will have done no work at all and prefer to just let something percolate up through the rehearsal period, which is often a process which actors are unaware of ourselves as to how it happens. It's a very intangible, mercurial process, that way of finding, of being offered a part and then standing it up on its feet. And a lot of actors are very reluctant to talk about it, almost as if we talk about it or if we let it into the light, it will evaporate and we won't be able to do it anymore. So, I mean, I would imagine a bit like your job, you know, when somebody comes in through the door, you have to immediately make the decision as to how best to try and unlock what they've come in to talk about. And I'm sure that, you know, some people need a lot of cajoling, some people need a firm hand, some people need silence. It's a bit like that in the acting game. You receive a part, and as I say, some actors will take a very, very meticulous, detailed approach to working out what they want to do. Some people even come into the rehearsal room on day one with the performance virtually intact. I mean, you know, they've sort of done it before they've even turned up. Whereas other actors are still struggling to learn the lines 4 nights before the opening night. And the director's job, which is what makes it so fiendishly tricky, is to try and combine these very disparate approaches from a group of, you know, 10, 15, 20 actors into something whereby when the curtain rises on the first night, everybody's moving at the same speed and hopefully in the same direction.
Let's take the most recent role you were in, Michael, with The Unfriend. I mean, how did you get into that role?
Well, the role was, it was a very peculiar role. I know you saw it, Peter, because we had a drink afterwards. And the play was a dark farce by Stephen Moffat, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes and Doctor Who, a very celebrated writer. It was his first stage play. And he had offered me the role of this deadly dull neighbour, who's in fact known in the cast list as the neighbour, and that's because nobody can ever remember his name. I decided it was Derek, but I had no. With
apologies to all the Dereks.
With all the Dereks, yeah, and some of my best friends are called Derek. But the whole point of this particular part, which, you know, as I said, was in a dark farce, was that this neighbour came in at various very inopportune moments in this sort of family's private calamity, who lived next door to him, and all he wants to talk about is party wall agreements. And he's ineffably cheery, and he's completely impervious to any hints that perhaps he might like to sling his hook because they've got problems in their own house. He's virtually bomb-proof. And so therefore, there wasn't very much to go on. And when I sat down at the read-through with the other actors, who I'd only just met 20 minutes before when we all arrived to start this project and went round the table and introduced ourselves, many of the actors I didn't even know, when we came to read out the play for the first time, which is customarily what you do when you sit and start to rehearse a play, you usually start with a read-through. I wasn't quite sure what was going to come out of my mouth, whether I was going to say it in the accent which I normally use to speak, or whether something else was going to come out, perhaps something a bit more estuary, or something perhaps a bit more countrified. Anyway, this voice emerged and I thought, oh, this sounds all right. I don't know why I've made that choice. I literally didn't know why I made the choice to do the initial read through, but nevertheless, so I did that. They seemed very happy with it. I worked on that. Decisions came to me during the rehearsal period. I often wasn't sure why I took a particular decision to say a line in a particular way. It was only at the end of the job, this is nearly a year later, when Stephen wrote to me after curtain down on the last night and said, just to say, Michael, I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to you after the post-show drinks on the last night, but thank you very much. You know, loved Your Neighbour and it was marvellous. And I said to him, and it only came to me as I was replying to his very kind email, I said, I think you have to thank a chap called Stan Maunders, Stephen. I said, I wasn't aware of it during the rehearsal period, but the fact is that Stan Maunders was a customer in my parents' sweet shop in Brighton in the 1960s. He'd come every Sunday morning, always dressed in his trademark greasy cap and gardening jacket and gum boots, and he'd park his arse next to the ice cream fridge in my parents' sweet shop, and he would stay there for an hour, and he was always incredibly cheery. He would never leave. He was deadly dull, and my parents sometimes couldn't even face having to deal with him. And he was impervious to threats or entreaties or hints like, I'm so sorry, Stan, we've got to shut the shop now because our house is on fire. He would just continue his merry way, talking about his allotment or his caravan holidays. He was actually a lovely guy. You know, that was the point. He was not he was a lovely man, but he was just absolutely impervious to the environment around him. And at 11 sharp every Sunday morning, he'd always leave the shop with his trademark, well, cheery bye, and he'd leave, and that would be it until the next Sunday morning. And I realised only after the job finished that actually Stan Maunders had been the person that I'd obviously had in my subconscious when I started rehearsing this part. And rather sweetly, when I explained this to Stephen in an email and said, you have this man called Stan Maunders to thank from my deep past 55 years ago, because I realised that was the neighbour, Stephen very sweetly got back and said, Stan Maunders. He said, that's exactly what Charles Dickens would have called him if he'd written the character.
Absolutely.
So there you had a model in your mind of that.
Well, actually, I didn't have a model in my mind. I had a model in my subconscious.
Yes.
That's
so
the
you were
point
only aware of it afterwards.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
That's really interesting. So,
yeah.
but but with or without your conscious thinking, you had a model.
I did.
What about when you don't have a model?
Well, then it's obviously more difficult, and that becomes that thing that you've just touched on, Peter, comes more into play when you are doing a play or indeed a film part or a TV part, where the environment of the film or the story is perhaps something that you have no experience of or no knowledge of. I mean, to take a ludicrous example that's just come into my head, what would happen if, for instance, I had to appear in a play which was based around sumo wrestling? It's unlikely to happen, but let's just take that as an example.
You don't quite have the build.
I don't quite have the build, and until recently, when I've got into sumo, funnily enough, I find it rather fascinating. But it's a sort of cultural thing. I watch it every 6 weeks on Japanese television when the next tournament comes around. But that's perhaps something I should have some therapy about with you after this edition. But I mean, I'm just taking that as an example. But what happens if, for instance, I was asked to play a trainer training somebody in Japanese sumo, which is not only a highly stylized and very odd scenario, but it's also completely based in a foreign culture which I don't have much understanding of. Let's just take that as an example. Well, there. I would very quickly realise that as a white British actor who's grown up playing, largely white British parts, sometimes foreign, but very much it's something that I would have normally something to call upon, either in my conscious experience or my subconscious treasure trove of memories and experiences, like with Stan Maunders. But with something like a part like I've described, then I would have to do a lot of research, and you know, you cannot just turn up and wing it and hope that somehow you can find something, because there isn't anything. So for something that where you are playing a part outside your life experience, then I think you have to do the work. And hopefully, if you do the work of a lot of reading, a lot of research, perhaps a lot of trawling the internet, you know, because obviously the visual image is also very important with that. Anything you can get about what the people look like, how they behaved, that also helps. And then hopefully that will trigger something in your store of personal life experience, which makes a fragile but essential connection.
This is so interesting, because I think our job as psychologists, when somebody walks in the door and they're coming with complaints or some kind of pain, it's a research project for me, because at first I've got to find out what is going on for this person,
Sure,
what is their
sure.
experience, and I have to listen very carefully to that before I say anything or do anything. I have to listen and as it were, do the research by asking questions too.
Can I ask? Well, let me ask you. Follow on from that what you've just explained to us. What about if you're asked to play a part which it is impossible to research, like say a Martian in Star Trek or something? What's the starting point for that?
Well, I think if you're playing something, and of course there's a lot of that sort of work about now, you know, with a lot of these sort of sci-fi blockbusters, there is a lot of parts available for men of my age where you have to go to a big studio in the home counties and stand around wearing a cape and holding a staff and talking about the Triords have invaded the kingdom of, you know, whatever. So there is a lot of that stuff. Well, there again, of course, the one advantage you've got there is that nobody else knows the world either.
Exactly.
So to an extent, you can sort of create your own truth. That is possible. I've got a bit of an example of that. It's not perhaps quite what you're talking about, but it sort of illustrates something. I was in Mike Leigh's film Topsy Turvy years ago,
wonderful.
which is based on well, it's not based on. It's a very faithful replica of what it was like to be in the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company in the heyday of Gilbert and Sullivan at their height in the 1880s, and we had to do a huge amount of research for that. I mean, all of us. That was explained to Mike Leigh when he interviewed me or us, that he was expecting us all to not only do a great deal of research on the period and the operas and all that, because he wanted our performances to really faithfully replicate what it was like to be in that environment.
But you love that anyway.
Well, I was a unique example because I loved it anyway. But most of the cast didn't know anything about GNS. You know, it just so happened that it's something that I grew up with. So I was, you know, really happy to do all that, and I had to do, you know, a lot less research than some of the lead actors who didn't really know much about it. But interestingly, it just so happened that the individual I was playing, who was a member of the opera company, who was which Gilbert and Sullivan employed, a chap called Frederick Beauville. It so happened that uniquely among the members of the opera company of that period, all of whose lives have been documented and written about, you know, albeit by geeks and experts and people who are really into Gilbert and Sullivan, this guy Beauville, there's nothing known about him. And it gave me a real problem, because all the other actors around me, you know, they had a wealth of material to call upon, who these individuals were, where they lived, who they were married to, how they died, you know, letters from them in many cases, a lot of photographs. But Frederick Beauville, there was nothing about. There was no archive material. So Mike Leigh said to me in the end, "You're going to have to create your own history." He said, you know, because there isn't one, and you've got to have one, because you've got to be able to rely on it if we have these big improvisations, which Mike Leigh was, you know, bases his work on. He does improvisations and then he films the distillation of the improvisations. That's how he works. It's a very time and money intensive occupation. So I had to create my own world for Frederick Boville. So I decided that he lived in Dorking. And I don't know why, but I went down to Dorking and I spent a Sunday in Dorking, and I went to a church service in Dorking, and I wandered up and down the high street, and I looked round the back streets, and I, did the idea of, I worked out what the demographic was in Dorking, and therefore. So I created my own world. So I knew that it was possible to travel up to London by train, and that's how much it would cost. So you had to have a certain amount. Anyway, all this stuff. And of course, it stood me in very good stead in that I was then able to create my own world of this man. It may have been imaginary in an otherwise largely real world. But by the end of it, I had a character that when I was required to do these very involved improvisations that Mike Leigh relied upon, I had my own character to call on. Interestingly, and I'm going to let you interrupt in a moment, I must just add a coda. Right at the end of the film, on the last day, we're just waiting to film, and the actor next to me, Vince Franklin, who's on telly all the time, wonderful comedic actor, who was playing a much better known individual in the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, the great Rutland Barrington, who I knew everything about. We're standing waiting to shoot. This is right at the end of a 6-month gig. And Vince turns to me and he says, yeah, it's funny, Simo. He said, Boville. He said, interesting name. He said, it's interesting because Rutland Barrington's bank manager was called Boville. I said, well, thanks for telling me on the last day. So I hurry off and I do a bit of research on, and I ask him a bit more about it. It turns out that that Rutland Barrington's bank manager was a Mr. Twining of Twining's Tea. They used to also run banks. Hang on in there, it gets easier in a minute. And there was a Twining's bank right next to the Strand Theatre, to the Savoy Theatre, where the operas were on, and I got in touch with Twinings to still do the tea, and I got a letter back from the descendant of the great Twining, who still runs Twinings Tea. He sent me a lovely letter. I'd enclosed a photograph of Frederick Boville, the only photograph there is of him, and he sent me back a photograph of his ancestor from that period, and they were the spitting image. And suddenly I realised that that's probably what happened, is that he got into the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company by way of the fact that one of the stars of the company used his bank, and it was probably his brother or his cousin.
See, what I'm struck by is that you start at the beginning of your story, you had to use your imagination, and I'm interested in the parallels between psychologists and actors, and if you like, the differences as well as the similarities. And here's the similarity. We have to use our imagination because we have to imagine what it's like to be in a patient's shoes, and part of the training with good training institutions, you have to be a patient yourself really before you qualify. So I'm really interested in that. Here you had to be very imaginative and make up this whole Dorking story. So it's great.
The whole, empathy is a very big deal for clinical psychologists and all psychotherapists. And there's an interesting thing happened recently which has got a lot to do with empathy, in that I heard Brian Cox being interviewed on the radio, and someone put it to him that there's an idea going round that only actors who've been through a particular experience should be allowed, really, in a way, to play that experience. Now, Brian Cox's reaction, you can imagine, was on Radio 4, he said bollocks. And in a way, if that was true, that you could only play what you had been through, or you could only work with clients that you had had very similar experiences to, well, empathy would go out the window, wouldn't it? There would be no imagination.
No.
And what's your take on that?
Well, it's a very hot topic at the moment.
Is it really?
Well, incredibly hot topic in the acting game because, in line with, the general trend really in these things, the idea now is that, should you play gay characters if you are not yourself gay when there are so many wonderful gay and bisexual actors about?
Sure.
Should you play a transgender part if you are not transgender yourself? Should you play somebody who's disabled if you're not disabled yourself?
Right.
I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but even 5 or 10 years ago, this was not a conversation that people were having.
Our point is to act, surely.
Yeah.
To be what you're not.
Yeah, that's right. But of course, I suppose if you are a disabled actor,
Yeah.
and you see an able-bodied actor playing a disabled actor when there are so few parts for you anyway, you might quite rightly say, "Can you give us a break?"
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Why not go off?
That's the argument. Isn't
That's
it?
the argument,
Yeah.
and it's a good argument. So I think there's been a very necessary transition in that idea of that people should. That people who have a more immediate connection with a particular set of circumstances of any character should be at the front of the queue.
Yeah,
but of course,
I can appreciate that. I'm not quite sure that's what I'm getting at. And I've got absolute sympathy for that point of view. But I'll take you back again. I mean, in acting anyway. I mean, there will be things that you play that nobody's ever played. We're back to kind of The Martians or whatever, that kind of thing. And again, that's, you don't want to decry the power of imagination, do you?
No, you don't. You don't, and it's very important. And I think that generally as regards that, as regards this general shift, this general trend at the moment towards unless you have immediate experience of the part, you shouldn't really be unless you're Welsh, you shouldn't be playing a Welshman. It is undoubtedly, I think, stifling that what I call that creative imagination that all actors feed on.
It's rather like the idea that some people would say, unless you have suffered with, say, alcohol dependency, you should not treat patients who are complaining of alcoholism or something like that.
Exactly.
And I don't think that is true.
You don't think that's true?
No. It's different. I completely, that argument you've given for the disabled act, I accept, and I think it's a very powerful argument. I accept that. I don't think you have to have had, say, a psychotic breakdown to be a good psychologist. Interestingly, in some African tribes, that's the way it works. I do think that as part of our training, you do need to be in touch with yourself. You need to know, what your character's made up, what your personality's made up of. But I don't think you actually have to have had trauma, say, to be a good therapist.
That's interesting. I mean, because of course in your profession, you have the same dilemma, don't you? Is that people are coming through the door with a range of things that they need to have evaluated, some of which will strike you very keenly, and some of which you will have no experience of at all. I remember, I had therapy for several years, about 15, 20 years ago, and with a wonderful therapist. I won't mention her name, but she lives quite near where we're recording this thing, and she was great, but understandably kept that barrier, the professional barrier, very. But I remember on just a couple of occasions I would talk about things that, some of which seemed quite anodyne to me, but she would suddenly well up. Yeah. It was as if I had touched on something which she felt so keenly herself that she was not, that she took a few moments to keep the professional barrier going. It was like I just unintentionally just lanced through her professional carapace.
And how did that affect you, if at all?
Well, it obviously when you are with a therapist and you suddenly see them, albeit momentarily, become a person. Now, I don't mean that unkindly, like they're robotic, but they are very much there as somebody that will reflect back to you,
Blank screen.
Yeah, blank screen. So if you ask them something, well, how do you feel about it? They will say, or what's your, so you don't really, and of course, as a, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, is that when you're in therapy, or when I was in therapy anyway, you are, particularly as I'm an actor, of course, you are very aware, you are desperate to get some idea of their private life. So I would be talking to, let's call her Anne. I'd be talking to Anne, and occasionally I'd hear a kettle being boiled in the next room. And I'd think, oh, there's somebody else here.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that you wanted an applause at the end of every session.
I always want applause. But I mean, you know, you go through all those things. You know, if you think, oh, you know, does she find me quite attractive? All these things, you know. And, oh, there's a kettle being boiled. And then once I heard a dog. And once I turned up and Anne was palpably still recovering from the session before me. She had, you know, she was very, you know, she was reaching for the tissues and trying to pretend it was a cold. But obviously, you know, she'd had a very thorough session before me. I must, sorry, I don't... This takes me to something else that might be of interest to our discussion, is that in the summer of 1982, this just come to me, in the summer of 1982, my dad had a stroke, and I was at Bristol Old Vic at the time, and I'd never suffered personal loss. And my mum rang and said, no, don't worry, Mikey, but Dad's had a stroke and he's in Brighton General Hospital, and, you know, don't come home at the weekend. So I went home at the weekend and I went to see my dad, and I went to see him for the next couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. I'd come home every Sunday, and on about the 3rd or 4th visit, I'd always go in on a Sunday afternoon. It was a roasting hot, high summer. And by then, Dad wasn't really making sense. He was trying to say stuff to me, but I couldn't, you know, it was a struggle to make out what he was saying. So I was trying to sort of busk it with him. And I left him one afternoon, and somebody came up to me, seemingly wearing a nurse's outfit. And she said to me, are you Mr. Simkins? And I said, yeah. She said, you have to prepare your mother for the fact that your father is going to die. And I was so horrified by what she said that I thought for a moment, this is the sort of madness you have when you're in shock, is that perhaps she was a cleaner who needed reporting, that was a sort of cleaner who was trying to meddle with people in the ward. You know, like sometimes you get the people who come up and say, oh yeah, and you think, and of course then I drove down to Brighton seafront, and I realised that she wasn't a cleaner. She was the nurse, staff nurse. You know, she was trying to say to me, your dad isn't going to make it, and you have to start preparing for this. And I sat on the beach, and I was overwhelmed with grief, and I was crying my eyes out on the beach by myself. This was before I went home to report this to Mum. And as I was in the middle of my extremis, a part of me said, I can remember it now, a part of me, my mind said, now, this is what it's like. Now, this is what you're doing with your hand. You're rubbing it back and forth across your forehead. This is what you do when you do, Mikey. This voice in my head was saying to me, when you are in grief, lock this away, because this is going to be great for a play one day. And then a third part of me said, what are you like?
Yeah. Sure.
You've had the worst news of your life. Your dad is going to die.
And that's how you're coping.
And yet, but this second voice that was saying, this is what you do, and this is a great trick, Mike. This is what men do. They rub their head back and forth. Use this. This is going to be great. I mean, it was like so cold and calculating. The actor's side of me, storing this experience already, even as I was experiencing, saying, yeah, there's one for your locker. And of course, later on, I did play a part where I was coping with this, and I remember using this thing. And it still sends a chill into my heart that in the middle of my most vulnerable moment in my life to date, I still had this sort of cold, clinical sense of, yeah.
But you've touched on something that I feel passionate about, and that is that it's so important for us as human beings to integrate both the things that we like about ourselves and the things perhaps we're less fond of. And that, you know, in Jungian terms, you will split that off and make it your shadow, and you will be, you know, what people see is your persona, but really the whole of you is the shadow plus the face. And in that situation, the way you've just described the story, you have integrated, you've brought together that part of you that says, you know, I'm not particularly proud of that. There's a part of me that was coping with this grief by, you know, thinking about acting and how I could use those behavioural signs. And yet, the fact that you could tell us this story shows that you're not in denial about it, that you've brought it back in. And that's, well, I think that's what therapy's about, is being integrated and knowing, you know, what your strengths are, what your, if you like, weaknesses are, what your vulnerabilities are. That's a better word, your vulnerabilities. And living less uncomfortably with them, not, say, drinking them out or irrigating them, trying to drown them, but irrigating them. Yeah, it's a very powerful story.
But I remember also Anne, the therapist, saying to me at one point, she said, "You're very entertaining, aren't you?" And I thought, yeah.
and she said, probably a pretty useful attribute for an actor. Really,
yeah, her point was, it's not a useful attribute when you're trying to have therapy.
Yeah, no. My therapist once said to me, "Me think he doth complain too much."
Can I ask you about another aspect of acting, and that's about memory? Because I must admit, I heard you on the radio last Sunday. I'll just let the listeners know what's going on here. So, in the Unfriend, which we've talked about, Michael has to appear on stage towards the end, where he's actually dead. We don't know he's dead till the very end, when Miss Shearsmith pushes him over. But he has to sit for a very long time, perfectly still, but in an upright position. And Michael on the radio last Sunday told Paddy O'Connell how he did this, which was by learning poetry. Just tell us a bit more. Well, maybe I've told everyone everything, but just tell us a bit about that.
No, I mean, I decided I had to spend about 12 or 15 minutes completely stock still on stage every night, twice on Saturdays and Thursdays, and it was very important that my eye line didn't waver, because that would suggest that I was aware of what was going on around me. So it was, you know, it could be a problem, not only concentration, but obviously when you do 107 shows, and inevitably boredom can be an issue. You know? So it's easy to start looking at the audience, and so I was determined, you know, to do my best, because the whole climax of the play relied on the fact the audience didn't know what this guy was doing there. So I decided that the best way, rather than just sort of, you know, count the seconds, was to try and find a displacement activity. And so I decided to try and learn a poem a week in my head. I didn't mouth it or even, but you know, and then on the final day of each week, I would try and recite the poem in my head as I was sitting there stock still, and see if I could remember it. But it also fulfilled another function, is that, you know, I'm 66 now. And it is an inevitable consequence of all actors that eventually their memory starts to let them down. And you know, I've been on stage with actors who have not been able to look in the mirror and admit what's happening to them. I mean, it's not like a switch being flicked. People who, when they're younger, could do Hamlet suddenly find that they can't manage as much. It's not like I can't now remember a line, but they have to be. As actors, we have to be realistic about what we can manage, and I've had enough experience of you know, in some cases very famous actors I've worked with who have not been able to stare themselves down and realise that it's time to start cutting their coat to fit their cloth, you know, and I'm determined not to do that. But one of the ways that obviously one can keep your memory sharp is by trying to learn, you know, learn poetry, and I found it very useful, because certainly as a stage actor it's not so essential on screen, but as a stage actor, the world of the stage is no place for somebody that has memory issues.
Right, absolutely,
it's a hostile and alien environment.
Sure. And you've actually, so you're saying quite clearly that, well, to put it in very simple terms, it's either use it or lose it, really, aren't you? You're saying by keep practicing with your memory, that's keeping it.
I believe it. Well, I think we discussed this informally, Peter. Is that you can't change? You know, you can't change a profound trend, but you can certainly help to keep your memory clear by using it.
If you're suffering with a neurodegenerative illness, it's very, very difficult, clearly, and learning poems is not going to really retard the course of the illness. But use it or lose it is a pretty good line for most of us who are not suffering with illnesses. Yeah.
Yeah. and that's what I try to do. And also, of course, I mean, the other good thing about being on stage is that it's hard work. As you get older, it really is hard work. But it is a constant daily workout. And one of the problems of doing telly parts is that, because it's a wonderful thing to do, but unless you're playing the lead, it's a very bitty profession.
Sure.
You're needed perhaps Tuesday, then perhaps a week Friday, and perhaps 2 weeks Monday. You turn up, you don't really know anybody on the crew, or and you sit in your little trailer or your caravan or in the waiting room. You have too much to eat. You have a big fried breakfast. The heating's always on in your trailer, even if it's 80 degrees outside. So you fall into a stupor, and then suddenly, you're shaken from it, and somebody says they're ready for you now, Michael. And it's probably been 5 hours since you arrived on the location. You go on and you've got 5 or 6 lines. It's not easy to keep your mind sharp in those circumstances. Whereas theatre, you have to, because you can't do it otherwise.
There's a whole discussion, isn't there, about the group dynamics of working in a cast and with the backstage people and working as a team, which you don't get presumably when you're...
But I also think, I'd be interested on your thoughts. The other wonderful thing about being a stage, particularly a stage actor, but also telly, if the part's good enough, is that it is a very tribal and very convivial collegiate atmosphere, and I think that's very, very important for mental health as well. And I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously isolation and solitude must be a big factor in people's mental.
A lot of therapists work in very isolated ways, and we know that if they do, like they're seeing client after client after client, as it were, maybe having only limited supervision. If there's not something built in where they are having informal contact with people in the same game, they can burn out much more quickly.
Is that the case?
Yeah, and it's quite when you're with other actors, I'm sure you talk about acting a lot and what's going on, but you have gossip, don't you, and like anecdotes, and people talk about their different hobbies and their families and so on. But a therapist can get very isolated from that. Especially if they're like in private practice or single-handed practice, unless they find an outlet for that, they can burn out very quickly.
Yeah. Well, certainly on stage, the actors you're with. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's like trying to scale Everest, but you are completely dependent. You are dependent on each other, both on stage and off.
Sure.
And a company can become intensely tribal. I mean, the cast of The Unfriend that I've been with for 6 months now. By the end, the bond is absolute, and even one's partners or loved ones who come into the theatre, perhaps between shows to have a cup of tea or what, they can often feel very. Left out, exactly so, because they're actually entering an intensely private and tribal world where the only people that can really experience it are the people who are going through it night after night, night after night. But what's also interesting is that within days of the job ending,
the tribe disperses.
It's just shattered.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I've learned from bitter experience that on the last night of a long run of a play, particularly if it's one that I've really enjoyed, I always try to leave the last night party early.
Right.
Because the moment that curtain is down, the whole raison d'etre of you all being together is gone. Yeah. There's nothing to talk about other than, wasn't that good?
Yeah.
And I found, it's one of the reasons Stephen Moffat didn't get a chance to say goodbye to me after The Unfriend last night, is that I tend to clear off because it's like prolonging a corpse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mindful of time, just one quick question again, Michael. We were talking earlier about how you get into roles and how you keep the boundary between your personal life and then that actor. And we were talking about some film actors we know will stay using that accent throughout the time of the shooting of the film. Do you have any thoughts about that? Are you the kind of person who makes that break, and there's Michael and then there's Michael in a particular part?
Well, obviously I try to, because one's personal sanity relies on not becoming so involved that the two worlds merge. But I'm not always successful in it, as my long-suffering wife will tell you. You know, there are instances where parts have. I mean, you know, I don't want to overstate it, because I've never played a part that has completely overwhelmed me in the way that with some people it has to. Otherwise, they can't do it. I mean, I don't know about this, but I'm thinking of, you know, some of the great modern parts. I'm thinking perhaps of somebody like Mark Rylance in Jerusalem, you know, which was, you know, this extraordinary tour de force. Yeah. It's interesting actually, because, you know, it's usual with actors that if you go and see a friend in a show, you will perhaps pop round and see them afterwards, albeit briefly, and we all know what the game is, that they've got limited time and they might have another performance. But I remember when I don't know Mark that well, but I was at drama school with him, and he got me the ticket, which was lovely. But when I went to see Jerusalem, which is this sort of 3-hour tour de force by Mark, extraordinary performance, and I said to him afterwards, I just dropped a line saying, you know, can I just pop round and see you? And Mark, quite rightly, just texted back, no, Mike, I don't see anybody after the show. And I thought, yeah, quite right too, because I think I think when you're playing a part like that, at least you need some time to decompress, really. Sure. And certainly in parts I've played, I have sometimes, you know, if I'm playing an angry man, I can become a bit more angry at home, or and Julia's noticed this, my wife, and you know, to an extent it happens with her as well. So there is a certain amount of bleed through, but you have to try and keep a check on that, because
that's so important for therapists too. The last thing we want to do is keep the boundary,
and that can't be easy, I would imagine, with your profession either, can it?
It's something you can learn, and it's something that can evolve over time, but you've got to be conscious of it. You've got to make it happen.
And I think having other interests is really important.
Yeah. And I mean, I know perhaps you don't want to answer this, but you know, as somebody that's had therapy, how do you cope when perhaps the therapy doesn't work or goes wrong, or you hear 3 months later that, you know, something terrible has happened to a person that inevitably you've become intensely connected with? How do you cope with that?
The first answer to that is that we should all have supervision.
Absolutely.
That you've just given the reason for having supervision. So you take your difficulties and your challenges to the supervisor who's monitoring the work, and that's the first thing. Second thing,
I think you also need to have a very rich life outside of your work. And I put that in simple terms, that it's good to work hard at something other than your work.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you've got to be absorbed in something else. I don't mean just distracting or
no,
but. You know.
We go to the theatre a lot.
Yeah, I'm in the theatre a lot.
Thank goodness.
Now that we do have to finish soon, so it's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much. It's been. We could talk all day.
I've enjoyed it.
Good. One last question then. What's been your favourite role?
Well, look, I grew up in a what I call a showbiz family. Not a showbiz family, but my dad played the tenor sax. He was a bit of a dasher, my dad, a bit like Ronald Colman, you know. He had a bit of a way with the ladies, and I grew up, all my childhood was spent in pubs and bars watching him play the tenor sax, and I grew up in jazz and the Great American Songbook, and my brother is one of Britain's finest jazz alto sax players, and my other brother is a very decent semi-pro player. So I was steeped in what I'd call the Great American Songbook. That's really what and also in British TV and all that. So look, you get asked to do the musical Chicago. So you're in the West End. You're dressed in a tux. You've got 2 spotlights following you everywhere you go on stage, and you're sitting down singing a song. You've got a live band behind you swinging like a barn door, and you've got Lee Zimmerman in fishnets on one knee, and you've got Denise Van Outen in fishnets on the other knee. And as I say to people, it's a dirty job, but somebody's...
Michael, thanks so much. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about you, Peter, but I really enjoyed that.
Stewart, it was a great afternoon. And thanks again to Michael for joining us. I thought he was entertaining, engaging, and it was great. And I want to thank the listeners too for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Yes, thanks. And please look out for further episodes of The Psychology of Almost Everything. And we'll be back on the airwaves again soon. But for now, goodbye and take care. Thank you very much.